There is a church in the middle of Missouri that was bombed by German planes over London, and nobody ever told the congregation it was moving to a small college town on the Missouri River. Number 1 on this list isn't a ghost story or a rumor. It's a real 17th century building that survived the Blitz, sat as a burned-out ruin for over 20 years, and then got shipped across the Atlantic Ocean stone by numbered stone and put back together exactly as its original architect designed it. Inside a town most Americans couldn't find on a map. Stay with me until the end and I'll walk you through exactly how that happened and why it happened in the 1960s of all decades. Missouri is a state most people only pass through on the interstate on their way to somewhere else. Kansas City to St. Louis, and nothing in between worth the exit ramp. But get off that interstate and past the courthouse squares and the river landings nobody bothers widening the road for anymore. There's a whole layer of this state that simply stopped changing somewhere around the 1960s and never got around to catching back up. Old mining towns still shaped by a single furnace. River ports still laid out for steamboats that quit running generations ago. A courthouse column with an actual cannonball still lodged inside it, and a village that the federal government legally froze in place decades ago and never unfroze. These aren't reconstructions built for tourists. Nobody trucked an old signage or painted a fake facade to sell a postcard. These towns simply never had a reason to tear the old buildings down. So they didn't. And the version of Missouri that most of the country left behind somewhere around the Kennedy and Johnson administrations is still standing here, going about its business. Before we get into all of it, if you're the kind of person who would drive 2 hours out of your way just to see something like that column, go ahead and hit subscribe. And drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from tonight. Let's count it down. Number 13. Glasgow. Tucked into a bend of the Missouri River in Howard County, Glasgow was founded in 1836 by 13 investors who deliberately bought high ground, land safe from the floods that had already wiped out the settlements before it. The town's real claim to fame came in 1879, when engineer William Soy Smith built what's considered the world's first all-steel bridge here. A 5-span crossing over the Missouri River constructed for the Chicago and Alton Railroad. For one brief moment, this little farming and hemp trading town sat at the center of American engineering history. That original bridge was eventually replaced with a heavier one to handle more traffic, but the town around it barely blinked. Glasgow has weathered Civil War skirmishes and repeated flooding, including the catastrophic flood of 1993, and today it still holds a population of a little over 1,000 people, surrounded by its original brick storefronts. It's a town that quietly pioneered something the whole country eventually copied, then just went back to farming like nothing happened. Up next is a town with even more paperwork behind its old buildings, and a lot more of them still standing. Number 12. Boonville, named for the sons of Daniel Boone, who scouted the salt licks across the river in the early 1800s. Boonville's real distinction isn't one single landmark, it's the sheer volume of them. More than 400 separate properties here are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, spread across 8 separate historic districts full of Greek Revival and Queen Anne homes that a stagecoach passenger from 1880 would still recognize on sight without missing a step. The old Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad depot, built in 1911 in a Spanish mission style unlike any other station on the line, now serves cyclists riding the Katy Trail instead of the 25 to 30 trains a day that once rolled through here in the town's busiest years. Boonville leaned on the railroad, then on the river trade, and when both slowed down, the town simply held on to what it had already built instead of tearing it down for something newer. Next on the list is a town you can walk from end to end in about 5 minutes, and that's exactly the point of it. Number 11. Kimmswick, a quarter-mile square of a town on the Mississippi River south of St. Louis, founded in 1859 by a dry goods merchant named Theodore Kim. Kimmswick has never had more than a couple hundred residents, and today it holds around 150 people across a few dozen households. In 1993, when a historic flood tore through neighboring river towns, Kimmswick's own residents built a 10-foot levee by hand to keep their downtown dry, and it worked. A local baker turned that story into a dessert, a towering, multi-layered apple pie now called the Levee High apple pie, served at a restaurant called the Blue Owl that's since been featured on national television more times than most small towns see in a century. Just outside town sits Mastodon State Historic Site, where actual Ice Age mastodon bones were discovered alongside human-made stone tools. Some of the earliest solid evidence anywhere in North America of people and mastodons sharing the same ground. Walk the 4 or 5 streets that make up the whole town and you'll pass more antique shops and restored cottages than actual residents, and almost nobody sells. In the last several years, only a handful of homes in Kimmswick have changed hands at all. Kimmswick is proof a town doesn't need to be big to simply refuse to disappear. Number 10 takes us to a building that spent 25 years quietly falling apart before anybody agreed to save it. Number 10. Waynesville, seat of Pulaski County, built around a courthouse square that old Route 66 used to run straight through. The oldest building on that square is the old stagecoach stop, a log structure built around 1853 by a stagecoach operator named William Walton McDonald. During the Civil War, occupying Union troops commandeered the building as a field hospital. It survived the arrival of the railroad that ended the stagecoach business for good, and survived decades afterward as a hotel and boarding house for workers building nearby Fort Leonard Wood. Then, sometime in the 1960s, it simply stopped being used at all. The building sat empty and decaying for almost 25 straight years, until the city finally condemned it, and it took a dedicated restoration effort through the 1980s to bring it back as the museum that stands on the square today. Waynesville's own courthouse, built in 1903, is one of only 2 surviving period courthouses left on the entire Missouri stretch of old Route 66. This is a town where the decline wasn't a metaphor. The building genuinely sat quiet and rotting for a full generation before anyone came back for it. Coming up at number 9, a town built entirely around one natural mineral deposit, and the man who turned it into an industry. Number 9, Potosi, county seat of Washington County, and arguably the birthplace of Missouri industry itself. Lead was first found here around 1763 by a French hunter nicknamed the Breton, and the mining camp that grew up around the discovery took his name, Mine Breton. Everything changed in 1797. When a Connecticut businessman named Moses Austin arrived, secured a Spanish land grant, and turned a scattered camp into an organized operation. Austin sank Missouri's first true mine shaft here and built the first reverberatory furnace west of the Mississippi River. And by 1814, the town had been renamed Potosi after the legendary silver mines of Bolivia. Moses Austin is buried here, under a concrete vault in the town's Presbyterian cemetery. But his real legacy walked out the door after he died in 1821. His son, Stephen F. Austin picked up his father's plan to settle American families in Spanish Texas and carried it through, which is exactly why history books remember Stephen as the father of Texas. And it all traces back to a lead deposit in a small Missouri town most people have never heard of. Number 8 brings us to a distillery that went quiet for 30 straight years and only recently started talking again. Number 8, Weston, a river town in Platte County that was, for a brief window in the 1840s, a bigger Missouri river port than Kansas City or St. Joseph. Weston was officially founded in 1837 with fewer than 300 residents. But a Kentucky-born businessman named Ben Holliday saw something in the local limestone spring water, the same spring Lewis and Clark had noted decades earlier on their way west. In 1856, Holliday opened the Blue Springs Distillery here, making bourbon the way his family had done it back in Kentucky. What's now called Holliday Distillery still operates on that exact original site, making it the oldest distillery west of the Mississippi River, still working out of its original location. But there's a gap in that story. In 1985, new ownership shifted the company's focus away from bourbon entirely, and the product that built the town's reputation simply stopped being made for 30 straight years. It wasn't until roughly a decade ago that a new team went back into the old rickhouses, tracked down the original recipe, and started distilling it again. Weston's downtown, meanwhile, never needed reviving. It just waited the whole thing out. Number 7 is a river town whose entire downtown museum lives inside a former church. Number 7, Rocheport, a tiny river town on the Katy Trail, where the Missouri River runs right along the edge of the bluffs. Rocheport's whole downtown is walkable in about 10 minutes, a strip of 19th century buildings that now serve cyclists instead of steamboat passengers. Its general store still operates the old-fashioned way, stocked with local goods. And its town museum is set up inside an actual 19th century church building rather than a purpose-built exhibit hall. There's no pretending here, no fake storefronts built to look historic. These are the real buildings river travelers walked into in the 1800s, repurposed instead of replaced. Rocheport survives today almost entirely on the strength of cyclists and hikers passing through on the trail. A slower, quieter kind of traffic than the highways that skip right past it a few miles off. If you're enjoying this one, now's a good time to go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we've still got 6 more towns left on this list. And the one waiting at number 1 might be the strangest true story you hear all week. Number 6. Hermann, founded by German immigrants along the Missouri River who set out quite deliberately to build a piece of the old country in the middle of Missouri. The Deutsheim State Historic Site preserves a cluster of 19th century German houses here that look like they were lifted straight out of the Rhine Valley, and the town leans into that identity hard, with an Oktoberfest that draws visitors from well outside the state every fall. Hermann's downtown is full of stone and brick buildings from that same era, wineries built into old hillside cellars, and a rhythm of daily life that still runs closer to a small European river town than to a modern American main street. Walk down to the riverfront on a quiet weekday afternoon, and you'll hear more German surnames read off historical markers than you will on most tours of actual small towns in Germany. It's one of the few places on this list that never really tried to modernize its image, because the whole point of Hermann was always to hold on to something specific rather than grow into something else entirely. Number 5 is where this list gets heavier, and it stays that way for a while. Number 5, and I want to be honest with you up front, this one is not a charming stop. Pierce City sits in the southwest corner of the state, a town of a little over 1,000 people today. In August of 1901, a young woman named Gazella Wild was attacked and killed while walking home from church. With no solid evidence, suspicion fell on the town's black residents, whose roots in Pierce City traced back to families brought there as enslaved people decades earlier. Over the following 35 hours, a mob formed. On the night of August 19th, a black man named Will Godley was lynched from the balcony of a downtown hotel and then shot as he fell. 2 more black men were killed before dawn. The mob went on to burn homes in the town's black neighborhood and drove roughly 30 black families out of Pierce City entirely, on foot, in the dark. For decades afterward, the town simply didn't talk about it. There was no marker, no public acknowledgement, just silence, sitting over a main street where nearly every trace of that community had been erased. Recent census records show the town's black population at essentially 0, a number historians directly connect back to that single night in 1901. It took over a century and the work of a local historian named Murray Bischoff before the town began holding public vigils to remember what happened here. Pierce City's original downtown was later destroyed by a tornado in 2003, so the buildings themselves are mostly gone now. What's frozen here isn't the architecture, it's the memory the town spent 100 years trying not to have. Number 4 takes us to a different kind of scar, one you can still see with your own eyes, embedded in stone. Number 4, Lexington, a river town in Lafayette County that was, in 1860, the 5th largest city in the entire state of Missouri, with a population over 4,000 people. That changed fast. In September of 1861, Confederate and Union forces fought a brutal 3-day battle here known as the Battle of Lexington, or the Battle of the Hemp Bales, named for the water-soaked bales of hemp Confederate troops rolled uphill as makeshift armor against Union artillery. During the fighting, a cannonball meant for Union positions overshot its target by more than half a mile and slammed into a column of the county courthouse instead. That cannonball is still there. It's embedded in the pillar today. More than a century and a half later, a genuine piece of Civil War artillery lodged in a building that's still in daily use as a working courthouse. Lexington's antebellum mansions and Victorian homes still line the streets around it, largely untouched, because the town's growth simply stalled out after the war and never fully picked back up. People drive in from out of state just to stand under that column and look up. Number 3 is a place where an entire town got frozen in place by federal decree, and it happened right in the middle of the 20th century. Number 3, Arrow Rock, a village on a bluff above the Missouri River that once served as a key crossing point on the Santa Fe Trail. Arrow Rock was platted in 1829, originally under the name Philadelphia, and by the start of the Civil War it had grown to nearly 1,000 residents. Then the railroads chose a different route. 2 fires tore through the business district, and by 1910 the population had collapsed to around 400. Today, Arrow Rock has somewhere between 50 and 60 full-time residents. But here's the detail that earns it a spot this high on the list. In 1963, the federal government designated the entire village a National Historic Landmark, one of the very few places in the country where that status applies to a whole town at once, rather than a single building. That single act essentially locked Arrow Rock's Main Street in place, preserving the home of 19th-century painter George Caleb Bingham, an 1834 tavern that still serves meals today, and a scattering of buildings that look almost exactly the way they did when steamboats last stopped here. Arrow Rock isn't frozen by accident. It's frozen by federal paperwork signed in 1963. And it's stayed that way ever since. Number 2 is the oldest town in the entire state, and it might be the best preserved secret in the Midwest. Number 2, Genevieve, the oldest permanent European settlement in the state of Missouri, founded by French colonists around 1750, decades before the United States even existed. The original town actually sat closer to the Mississippi River, until a catastrophic flood in 1785 forced residents to move the entire settlement 2 miles inland to the spot where it stands today. What makes Genevieve remarkable isn't just its age, it's what's still standing. This is one of the only places in North America where you can still find buildings constructed in the French colonial poteau en terre style, vertical hand-hewn log walls set directly into the ground rather than laid horizontally like a typical American log cabin. The Green Tree Tavern here dates to 1790, believed to be the oldest surviving building in town. And several nearby homes date to the early 1790s as well. In 2018, the National Park Service officially designated State Genevieve a National Historical Park, recognizing what locals already knew, that this small Mississippi River town holds one of the largest surviving collections of French colonial architecture left anywhere in the country. Everywhere else on this list, time slowed down. In corners of, say, Genevieve, it feels like it barely started moving in the first place. And now, the town that earns the very top spot on this entire list. Number 1. Fulton, home to Westminster College, and the setting for one of the strangest true stories in the entire state of Missouri. On March 5, 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood up in a college gymnasium here, introduced by President Harry Truman himself, and delivered a speech that coined one of the defining phrases of the 20th century, warning that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. That speech alone would be enough to put a small Missouri town on the map for good. But it's what happened here 2 decades later that earns Fulton the top spot on this list. After Churchill's death in 1965, Westminster College wanted a permanent memorial, something more lasting than a plaque on a gymnasium wall. So they went looking in London, and they found the ruins of the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, Aldermanbury, a 17th century church originally designed by the architect Christopher Wren after the Great Fire of London in 1666. That church had survived for centuries, until German bombs gutted it during the Blitz of World War II, leaving nothing standing but the outer stone walls. Those walls sat as an empty ruin in the middle of London for more than 20 years. Starting in 1966, workers carefully dismantled what remained of the church stone by stone, more than 7,000 individual pieces, each one numbered, crated, and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to a small town in mid-Missouri. Piece by piece, that bombed-out London church was reassembled on the Westminster College campus, exactly as Christopher Wren had originally built it nearly 300 years earlier, and it was formally dedicated in 1969. It still stands there today, a genuine 17th century English church, sitting quietly on a college campus in rural Missouri, with a museum about Churchill built into its foundation. Nearby, there's even a sculpture made from an actual slab of the Berlin Wall, a physical piece of the very divide Churchill warned the world about, decades before it was ever built. Most of the towns on this list got frozen by decline, by a railroad that chose a different route, or an industry that packed up and left. Fulton got frozen by intention, a bombed-out church rebuilt stone by stone inside a small Missouri college town, because a handful of people in the 1960s decided that some things were worth putting back together exactly as they used to be. So that's the list. 13 Missouri towns that the interstate skipped, that industry eventually moved on from, and that in more than one case, somebody deliberately decided to keep exactly as they were. None of these places have a stadium with their name on it. Most of them don't even have a stoplight. But every single one of them still has a main street you can actually walk, buildings you can actually put your hand on, and a piece of real American history that never got paved over to make room for something newer. If this made you want to go find one of these towns for yourself, Subscribe, because I go looking for places like this every single week. The forgotten ones, the quiet ones, the ones most road trips skip entirely without even slowing down. And before you go, tell me in the comments which one of these 13 towns you'd actually want to spend a weekend in. I'll see you in the next one.